The Euphrates laps against the mud brick quays with a rhythmic, heavy sound, carrying the scent of silt and distant cedar. Here in the shadow of the Ishtar Gate, Eleazar stands among a crowd of merchants and travelers. He is 24, a junior scribe among the Jewish exiles, his fingers stained and calloused from years of pressing reeds into wet clay and parchment. He wears a simple, dusty linen tunic, and at his waist hangs a leather belt holding his ink pot, the tools of a man who lives by the word. But today, the words he hears are not his own. A Babylonian storyteller, his voice rising over the clamor of the docks, recites the ancient lines of the... How does a believer handle the fact that the Bible is not the only ancient voice that remembers a great flood? Eleazar moves away from the noise of the quay, his mind racing as he navigates the narrow, dusty alleys of Babylon. To understand the weight of his anxiety, we must walk with him through the libraries and ruins of Mesopotamia, seeking to grasp the historical and cultural context of the Great Flood. In the coming moments, we will examine the biblical text of Noah alongside the ancient cuneiform tablets of the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh epics, the very stories that have just unsettled this young scribe. Our goal is not to use science to prove the supernatural or to settle every theological mystery with a single discovery, but to explore what is known, what is debated, and what these parallel accounts reveal about the world as it was. What Eleazar is beginning to realize is that his people are not alone in their recollection. Nearly every culture in the ancient Near East preserved a tradition of a world-altering deluge, a common memory etched into the clay of the earth and the consciousness of humanity. It is a shared heritage of the deep, where the lines between history, myth, and divine revelation meet in the rising waters of the distant past. We must look closely at how these stories align and where they diverge, for it is in those differences that the unique voice of Eleazar's faith begins to emerge. And as the sun sets behind the towering mud brick walls of Babylon, Eleazar retreats to the relative silence of his small quarters. The flickering flame of a clay oil lamp casts long dancing shadows across the room as he carefully unrolls the parchment he has carried through the city, the account of the generations of Noah. His calloused fingers trace the Hebrew characters, seeking the familiar rhythm of the word to steady his mind. He reads of a world that had become corrupt in God's sight and full of violence. In the Genesis text, the flood is not a divine accident or a sudden fit of temper. It is a deliberate, grieving response to a profound moral collapse. Eleazar notes the precision of the instructions, the 300 cubits of length, the gopher wood, and the coating of pitch. This was a vessel designed for stability amidst a cataclysm, a massive chest intended to carry the seeds of a new world through the judgment of the old. The world Eleazar inhabits is one defined by the power of water. To any inhabitant of the Fertile Crescent, the threat of the deep was a tangible reality. Unlike the predictable rising of the Nile in Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were volatile and often violent. In this flat alluvial plain, a heavy melt in the northern mountains or a prolonged storm could turn the life-giving rivers into instruments of absolute destruction, burying entire cities under feet of silt and mud. For Eleazar's neighbors, the flood was the ultimate historical marker, the line between the world that was and the world that is. Yet, as he leans closer to the scroll, reflecting on the promise of the rainbow, he perceives a radical difference in the character of the God of Israel. His God is not like the capricious deities of the Babylonian merchants, who seem to strike out in irritation. The God of the covenant is a judge who demands righteousness, yet he is also the one who provides the means of escape and establishes a lasting bond with a remnant. For the young scribe, the ark represents more than a survival craft. It is the physical manifestation of a promise that even in the midst of the storm, the Creator remembers His mercy. Still, the questions linger. He knows that just a few streets away, In the great libraries of the king, there are tablets of clay that tell a story so similar it cannot be ignored. To find the truth, he knows he must look at those ancient records for himself. The following morning, Eleazar makes his way to the House of Tablets, the vast library where the accumulated wisdom of the Mesopotamian world is preserved on thousands of sun-dried and kiln-fired clay slabs. His status as a junior scribe grants him a measure of access, though he moves with a quiet, anxious caution, his simple linen tunic contrasting with the more ornate robes of the senior Babylonian scholars. The air inside the library is thick with the scent of dry earth and the rhythmic scratch of reeds on wet clay. As his calloused fingers move across the stacked shelves, he finally locates the records he has heard whispered about in the market, the ancient accounts of the Atrahasis epic and the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. With a steady hand, Eleazar brushes the dust from the cuneiform wedges. Here, written in a script that has dominated the region for millennia, he finds a mirror to the story he holds dear. He reads of a hero named Utnapishtim, known as Ziusudra in even older Sumerian traditions, who was warned by a sympathetic god of an impending deluge intended to wipe out mankind. The parallels are startling, almost unsettling to the young scribe. The text describes the building of a massive vessel, the preservation of animals of every kind, and the sealing of the door with bitumen. Most striking of all is the account of the storm's end. Utnapishtim, like Noah, sends out birds to test the receding waters, a dove, a swallow, and finally a raven that does not return. For the historian, these similarities are the foundation of a long-standing scholarly debate. Some researchers argue that the biblical authors living in exile like Eleazar borrowed and adapted these Mesopotamian myths to suit their own theological needs. Others propose a different view, that both the Genesis account and the Babylonian epics are independent witnesses to a much older, singular event, a common memory of a cataclysm so profound that it became the shared heritage of every culture in the Near East. As Eleazar traces the sharp, angular wedges of the Gilgamesh tablet, he is wrestling with the same tension we face today. He sees the shared architecture of the story, the warning, the boat, the animals, the birds, but he also begins to notice the subtle, jagged edges where his own tradition refuses to fit the pagan mold. He realizes that while the what of the stories may align, the why reveals a chasm between his faith and the world of his captors. Leaving the shadowed halls of the House of Tablets, Eleazar seeks the open air of the riverbank, where the Euphrates flows as a swollen, chocolate-colored vein carving through the dust of the Babylonian plains. He walks slowly, his sandaled feet sinking slightly into the soft margins of the shore. He stops where the receding spring waters have left behind thick, cracked plates of gray silt, new earth laid over the old. For a scribe trained in observation, these layers are a physical chronicle of time, a constant reminder that in the land of Shinar, the threat of the deep is never truly gone. He watches the local laborers clearing irrigation canals, their lives dictated by the unpredictable rhythm of the rivers, and he realizes that for these people, a flood is not just a story. It is a recurring judgment of nature. If you want to go beyond this episode and see the wider historical world around the Bible, I gathered these studies in my book. There I go deeper into maps, empires, chronology, sources, and disputed questions that cannot fit fully into one video. The link to the book is in the description. Now let us return to the person at the center of this story, and to the world he had to live through. Eleazar kicks at a clump of dried mud, watching it crumble and dissolve back into the moving current. He is haunted by the precision of the Babylonian tablets he has just studied. If the dimensions of the vessel, the bitumen used for caulking, and the very species of the birds released are so nearly identical, he must ask himself a question that weighs heavily on his spirit. What makes the account of his people unique? He wonders if the God of Israel is merely a Hebrew reflection of the Mesopotamian deities, or if there is something fundamentally different in the voice that spoke to Noah from the heavens. As he looks out over the water, he begins to realize that the truth may not lie in the outward details of the storm, but in the character of the one who rides above it. He is searching for a distinction that the physical silt beneath his feet cannot provide, a distinction of purpose and of promise. Eleazar's observation of the river sediment connects across thousands of years to the work of 20th century archaeologists who sought to pull the truth of the deluge from the earth itself. In the late 1920s, Sir Leonard Woolley, excavating the ancient city of Ur, discovered something startling beneath the deep layers of human habitation, a massive 8-foot-thick deposit of clean, water-laid clay. There were no artifacts, no pottery, and no bones, just pure silt. Woolley initially believed he had found the definitive physical proof of Noah's flood, a layer of mud that had reset the clock of civilization. However, as excavations continued at other Mesopotamian sites like Kish and Shuruppak, similar clay layers were found, but they did not align in chronology. These were catastrophic localized floods, capable of wiping out entire city-states and reshaping the landscape, yet they were not a single, synchronized global stratum captured in one uniform moment of time. For the historian, this archaeological reality does not diminish the biblical record. Rather, it confirms that the world in which Eleazar walked was one fundamentally defined by the trauma of the deep. While archaeology has not produced a single physical signature that covers the entire globe, it reveals a civilization that lived in constant awareness of the deluge as a concrete historical marker. Eleazar feels this weight as he leaves the riverbank and returns to the elders of his community. Sitting in the flickering light of an oil lamp, he listens as they discuss the Sumerian king list, an ancient cuneiform record he has seen in the libraries of his captors. The elders point out a stark, chilling phrase in that list: "Then the flood swept over." To the people of Mesopotamia, history was not a continuous line. It was a fractured story divided into two distinct eras: the world that existed before the water and the world that struggled to survive after it. For Eleazar, the flood was not a myth to be debated by scholars, but a historical pivot point that defined the very nature of time and the fragility of man before his creator. Eleazar returns to his quiet quarters, the chaotic sounds of the city fading into the night, but the voices of the Babylonian epic still ringing in his mind. He spreads his own parchment, the scroll of the Torah, and begins to compare the words of his fathers with the clay tablets he studied in the temple libraries. In the Atrahasis epic, the great gods Enlil and Anu decide to wipe out humanity for a reason that seems almost trivial to Eleazar. The people have become too numerous and too loud. Their uproar prevents the gods from sleeping. To the Babylonians, the flood was an act of celestial irritation, a divine tantrum thrown by gods who viewed humanity as a mere workforce that had become a noisy annoyance. But as Eleazar traces the Hebrew letters of Genesis, he sees a different reality entirely. Here the waters do not rise because God is tired or inconvenienced. They rise because the earth is filled with violence and the wickedness of man was great. This is a moral crisis, not a logistical one. In the biblical narrative, we see a radical departure from the surrounding culture. The text effectively demythologizes the event. It strips away the petty, capricious whims of the Babylonian pantheon, gods who in their own epics cower like dogs at the storm they unleashed, and replaces them with the terrifying but consistent justice of the Creator. For Eleazar, this realization is a turning point. He understands that while the physical storm described by the storyteller at the docks might have been the same, the God of Israel was acting from a place of holy grief, not petty irritation. The deluge was not a chaotic accident of the heavens. It was a judicial response to a broken world, a cleansing that sought to preserve a righteous remnant through a covenant that the gods of Babylon could never conceive. This distinction gives him a strange hope. If the flood was a matter of justice rather than whim, then the survival of the human race was a matter of grace rather than luck. He begins to wonder if the physical remnants of such a grace still exist, hidden away in the high, cold places of the earth. Eleazar looks toward the northern horizon, where the heat haze of the Mesopotamian plain blurs the line between earth and sky. He knows that far beyond the site of the Ishtar Gate lie the rugged highlands of Urartu. In the scrolls he guards, the vessel did not merely drift. It came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat. To a scholar in Babylon, Ararat is not a single peak, but a vast mountainous kingdom, the high country of the north where the Tigris and Euphrates find their headwaters. This geographical detail has sparked a quest that has lasted for millennia. In our own time, the search for the physical remains of the Ark has led explorers to the 17,000-foot summit of Mount Ararat in modern-day eastern Turkey. They search for petrified wood, for the skeletal remains of a ship that would dwarf the largest Babylonian barges. However, as a historian, I must be careful to distinguish between the fervor of discovery and the reality of the record. While many expeditions have claimed to find the Ark, no peer-reviewed archaeological evidence currently exists to confirm the vessel's survival. In the harsh environment of the peaks, wood is either reclaimed by the earth or scavenged by ancient inhabitants for fuel and building. Eleazar, dipping his reed into the ink pot, does not need to see a piece of timber to believe the testimony of his fathers. For him, the physical survival of the Ark is secondary to the survival of the promise it carried. His faith is anchored in the preservation of the remnant, not the preservation of the wood. Yet, as he studies the trade maps of the northern caravans, he remains quietly curious about those mountains of the north. He wonders if the silence of those high, cold places still guards the secret of the world's rebirth, or if the Creator intended for the physical vessel to vanish, leaving only the memory and the covenant to guide the generations that followed. For Eleazar, the mystery of the mountain is a reminder that some things are kept in the hand of God, hidden from the eyes of men, but written forever on their hearts. The heavy, humid air of the afternoon breaks suddenly as a desert storm sweeps across the Euphrates. Eleazar seeks shelter under a reed mat awning, watching the rain wash the dust from the blue-glazed tiles of the Ishtar Gate. When the clouds finally part, a brilliant arc of color stretches across the sky, framing the massive Itemenanki Ziggurat, the temple that the Babylonians believe reaches the heavens. To the priests of the city, the storm is the breath of Enlil, or the wrath of Marduk, a reminder of the god's unpredictable temper. But as Eleazar looks at the rainbow, his mind returns to the final lines of the Genesis scroll. For him, this light is not a decoration for a pagan temple. It is the bow in the cloud, the sign of a legal and spiritual treaty between the Creator and all living things. The contrast could not be sharper. In the historical world of Mesopotamia, the universe was a place of fragile stability, always at risk of falling back into the primordial chaos that the gods themselves could barely contain. But in the theology Eleazar carries in his satchel, the world is governed by a God who binds himself to his creation. The flood was not a chaotic accident or a divine tantrum. It was a cleansing that led to a new beginning, anchored in a promise that the seasons would never again fail. Eleazar feels the weight of the noise of the myths, the shouting of the Babylonian storytellers, and the clatter of their many idols fade into the background. He listens instead to the voice of the law, a steady moral foundation that offers a peace the ziggurat cannot provide. He carefully rolls the parchment, securing it with a leather thong. The waters of the past were deep and terrifying, but the sky above him is clear. He has found the distinction he was searching for, the difference between a world ruled by fear and a world held by a covenant. Eleazar walks away from the river docks. his dusty linen tunic swaying as he heads back toward the Jewish quarter. He carries more than just a scroll. He carries a perspective refined by the tension of exile. As we look back at this young scribe and the world he inhabited, we see that the overlapping accounts of the deluge, from the clay tablets of Nineveh to the parchment scrolls of Jerusalem, are not proof in the sterile sense of a laboratory experiment. Instead, they serve as powerful historical witnesses. They are the echoes of a shared human trauma and a divine intervention, a memory so deep and so ancient that it survived the rise and fall of every empire that rose from the silt of the Tigris and Euphrates. Understanding this historical context does not diminish the biblical narrative, it enriches it. When we place the account of Noah alongside the epics of Atrahasis or Gilgamesh, the unique character of the God of Israel shines more brightly against the backdrop of the ancient world. We see a text that was not merely repeating a common legend, but one that was actively speaking into a culture of chaos to declare that human life has moral value and that the Creator is a God of justice, mercy, and covenant. The dust of the ancient Near East may cover the physical remains of the ark, but it cannot bury the truth of the encounter between the divine and the human. Like Eleazar, we are left to weigh the evidence of the past against the convictions of the heart, finding that history and faith are often two sides of the same enduring story. If you want to continue this journey more deeply, my book is available through the link in the description. In the next episode, we will move to another moment where faith, imperial power, and historical evidence meet in a particularly sharp way.